Thank you very much for joining this webinar. My name is Sarah Logan, and I'm a visiting fellow in the Africa program at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Today, we're discussing a topic of growing importance in the mining sector in African countries, local mineral processing and value addition. As African countries seek to retain a greater share of the value of their mineral wealth and end historical patterns of exporting minerals in unprocessed form, more attention is turning to how to expand local value addition in African countries, what enabling factors are needed, and how African mineral processing and value addition projects can achieve economic viability in what is a very competitive space. The mineral value addition ambitions of African countries are outlined in the Africa Green Minerals Strategy, launched by the African Union in December last year, as well as the national value chain strategies developed by a number of different African countries, all aiming to keep more of the value of their minerals on their soil. Despite policy momentum towards local value addition, realizing actual projects has been much slower in practice. This has been due to a range of factors. Some of them are country-specific, but there are also a number of challenges arising from the global market, especially the difficulty of competing against already established processing facilities, including in China. But better understanding these obstacles, as well as ways in which we can overcome them, is critical if we're going to move forward in actually achieving more local value addition in practice. And I have a great panel today to help us unpack these dynamics. We have Rosetta Chavala, who's an independent trade and business consultant in Zambia, Vitor Correa, who is the Secretary General of the International Raw Materials Observatory, INTRAW, and Veronica Bolton-Smith, the CEO of the Critical Minerals Africa Group. So today's event is in part to launch the most recent policy brief of the ECFR Africa program, which is titled From Ore to More, Mineral Partnerships for African Industrialization. It's co-authored by my colleague Theophilus Anchompong and myself. It's available on the ECFR website, and we'll also put a link in the chat. I also wanted to acknowledge the Africa Europe Foundation, whose funding made this work possible. And now, just before we turn to the panel, I want to flag that we will be reserving some time at the end of the discussion for Q&A. So if you have any questions, please do put them into the question box on Zoom, and we will come to them at the end of the panel. So now, I guess, just to kick into the questions, Rosetta, I'm going to start with you. You've worked extensively in mineral value addition, both from a research perspective, but also from roles in industry, including with a metal fabricator in Zambia and the Zambia Association of Manufacturers. And this has given you like a really interesting perspective into some of the constraints and opportunities within this space in Zambia. And I think would have a lot of lessons for other African countries too. And so maybe just to kick off the conversation today, could you share from your perspective what some of the key constraints are that have stopped mineral value addition taking off in Zambia to date, as well as where you see some of the most promising opportunities moving forward? What is needed to realize these opportunities, and are there ways in which external partners can support that?
Oh, thank you very much, Sarah, for this opportunity and for allowing me to contribute to such an exciting topic today. And as you rightly put it, I do have a privilege to actually have both industry experience, but also policy experience in this particular sector, especially biased to value addition, which is quite very interesting. So you talk about constraints of value addition to copper, especially specifically for Zambia. I think copper is the biggest and the big thing. They're quite spread in terms of what we can look at. And I would want to look at it in two parts. To first look at the production of copper itself, which then feeds into the downstream. So what happens in the upstream definitely affects what is then going to happen in the downstream. And so while we're talking about downstream, I want to obviously focus a little bit on what we are doing there that will then give us a raw material for value addition in the first place. And so if you look at the mining sector, specific in terms of mining itself, we have seen a steady increase in the last few years. So we've seen an increase and a drop, and then an increase again. So we did actually reach the 800,000 of tons that we're talking about today in about 2022 already. And then we saw a dip in 2023, 2024, and we basically are back up in 2024 end anyway, to about 820 plus 1,000 tons of copper. So basically what happened there was the issue of production, which was impeded by at least two mines, which government took over for different reasons. One was sold to government and the other one was in liquidation, and government had taken over that process. And so we saw very little production, basically in Mopani and KCM in the few years that government was operating those mines. Those mines are back to private sector, but obviously ramping up is going to take a little bit of time, but we have seen a bit of production happening there. What that then did for the last at least 3 to 4 years was actually then give trouble to the downstream, because then there were issues of access to copper for value addition. And we've been grappling with that the last at least 4 years. You've seen that manufacturers have been actually starved of the copper that they could then value add to. And when I say, obviously, the lowest we did go was almost around 600. And you'll be wondering, do we actually add value to 600? Why are we talking about access? Why are we talking about a shortage? Obviously, for the manufacturing sector, you're looking at very specific processed copper. To a certain purification of that copper, it has to be at 99.9%. And really, the manufacturers can only access that copper from Mopani and KCM predominantly. Luansha mine has a little bit of impurities. Kansanshi initially didn't even really have a smelter. Now they've got a smelter, but also the purification of the copper is not to 99.9% predominantly. They've got a few quantities. So basically, you've got two sources in Zambia for value addition if you're talking wire and cable. I should also be specific with that, because for the others, you can use it for something else that you really don't need conductivity and all those kind of things. So because those two mines were not producing, you then found that it was tough for any manufacturer to actually get enough raw material. And they would just basically scrounge around. And this is the period, again, we had quite a lot of interest in terms of manufacturers trying to come into the country. We are talking about 8 manufacturers now in Zambia. And remember, from the 70s to about 15, 20 years ago, we only had one company that added value to copper. 20 years ago, we had Newcastle come in, and just the last 5 years or so, we've had more than 5 entries in the wire and cable. So something is happening, but we do need to ensure that access to that raw material then is actually easier, available, and at the right pricing in terms of advantage for the local manufacturers. So that is one. Number 2, impeding production is obviously energy crisis that we have in Zambia. Of course, the mining sector has gone around it. Some are actually sourcing their own energy directly, but also we've got other intermediaries like CEC. We've now gone into solar to just complement the energy that the mining sector has. But that in itself has also constrained some of the expansion projects that the mining sector should have had in the first place. And more specifically, we haven't seen quite a lot of investment in Mopani and KCM to actually then warrant us to have access. So energy has been at the center of it. And energy is one of the challenges that translates also to the manufacturers themselves. In fact, right now, I feel it's more a crisis for the manufacturing sector than it is for the mining sector, because the mining sector has priority in terms of being given the energy, and the manufacturers really don't have. So the manufacturers have survived on alternative energy like generators, not even solar, which would be a little bit maybe in the long term cheaper, but they've relied on generation from diesel to generate for the times that they don't have power, or they've actually gone into agreements with the power utility to actually then bring in power, which is like times 2 the price that they're used to. And that has impacted on the competitiveness in the region and how much they can export some of those products, making it quite impossible for them to compete locally and also then regionally. So that has been a great and big challenge for the manufacturing sector. But beyond that, I think there's been quite a lot of inconsistent policy issues and institutional misalignment between what we aspire to do and what we have as a policy. So we aspire to be a value-add country to our raw materials, specifically in this case, copper. But you find that there's real appetite to export raw materials. So the policy basically is tilted to allowing us to export copper mainly at cathode level at the most. And that is like the most of it will go at cathode and below. And none of it is really left for the local industry. Companies like Mopani, for example, will have a 20% reservation for local production. But as I said, in the last 4 years, they almost produced nothing. So it was 20% of nothing. So the manufacturers didn't even actually get. The other mines don't even have that. They basically are giving you at their discretion if they can give you or not, what scale do you have or not, and that leaves out most of the SMEs cannot access copper really. So our policy to try and reserve local copper for local production has not been very clear enough on what we want to do. Remember, for argument's sake, 60% of the use of copper is actually wire and cable. And yet Zambia continue to produce a raw material that is below a raw material needed for wire and cable. Because the raw material you need for wire and cable is basically copper rod. But we don't see a lot of exports of copper rod, not just in this region, but internationally, which most of these so-called importers would actually be using it for. So if we could tilt the policy to actually speak to what we think would add value, because between copper cathode and copper rod is, for argument's sake, another $400 per ton in terms of return that this country should be having. So I think we should be vying for a little bit more value addition to the copper before it leaves this country, other than where we are. So I think we need to a bit align ourselves and be very clear on what we want to do. Of course, we've also struggled with skills issues. Remember, we only had one company that added value to copper. And so the skills, even by 20 years ago, were old skills. And this one company basically had a bit of old technology also in terms of how, especially on the side of the casting plant, how we melt the copper, how we make the copper rod and stuff like that. Machinery has been in there for 1970s. So we've missed that gap in terms of upskilling to newer technologies of what's required in the industry so that they're a bit more efficient, they're a bit more competitive, and so on and so forth. But also you find that initial companies have even furnaces that still use charcoal, for example, to melt the copper, when newer companies are plug and play kind of furnaces, which is electrical, you can switch it off anytime you want. That's not what you find in the biggest facility that we have currently. So again, those issues we need to refocus, and if copper is one of those sectors that we want to actually focus on as value addition, we need to align the required technology and the required skill. So basically, and obviously issues of access to finance and capital into that sector comes in. So basically, I think those are key issues and challenges that we face to try and upscale our value addition in that space. One of the key issues that the manufacturers have continuously also talked about is the pricing of the copper. Remember, the pricing of the copper is priced at LME, which basically then doesn't really give advantage to the local value adders because they're buying this copper exactly the way you would buy it wherever you're seated. Whether you're in Europe or China or in Zambia, you're buying copper basically at LME pricing. And that has been an issue, and it has been on the table to see then how much discount of LME can we give for the local manufacturers' benefits to make them a little bit more competitive, and also to give them the advantage as a local manufacturer who has access to the resource right here. So I think basically, those would be what I would call the key challenges for us to move into value addition. But of course, you asked about opportunities, and they are opportunities. Number one, obviously, we need to diversify beyond wire and cable. It cannot just be a sector of wire and cable. There's so many other things that you can use copper for. So we need to be a little bit more innovative. And I have seen some newer companies like Uniflex, even though it's still in a bit wire and cable, but they've now gone into enameled wired plants. They're going into more shapes. They're going into other products of copper other than just the wire and cable. And I think we have all been fixated to just that. And remember, wire and cable itself is a little bit phasing away in terms of conductivity. People are actually going for aluminium than they are going for copper. Of course, copper has longer conductivity and you can put it in there as an infrastructure longer, but it's cheaper to do aluminium. It's less vandalized. It's, you need a little bit less. And you see that the utilities have been moving to aluminium more than they actually have been putting in copper infrastructure. So we need to a little bit diversify and think about other kind of products when it comes to there. But we also need to look at ourselves as a regional hub. How do we harness our comparative advantage and competitive advantage as a country that is the biggest producer of copper in the continent? I mean, we are only second to Congo in the African continent.
I'm going to come back to you on that regional question. So please hold that thought, because I do want to come back to you on that. And I mean, it's interesting, this point you note about the LME price, because, in theory, local manufacturers should be able to purchase at a gate price that is less insurance and freight, but that's not really happening in Zambia. And I think there's some speculation as to why a proper discount is not being applied, but maybe that's something we can also pick up just now. But just, I guess, to note that the established practice is not what is happening specifically in Zambia. So it's an area that requires a bit of work. But just to go on to Vitor now, and building off what Rosetta has spoken about, just to share the European side of the story. And we know that the EU has set some ambitions around reducing its reliance on Chinese mineral value chains. So both increasing mining, but also mineral processing within Europe and diversifying procurement. European policymakers, at least, have been quite vocal about an interest in partnering with African countries in this endeavor. There's been some strategic partnerships that have been signed with some African countries, but also some of the strategic projects that have been approved over the last while have been in African countries. But I'd be keen to get your sense from your work at Interraw and your interaction with European industry players. How do they perceive these targets? Is there a sense that they are being motivated to enter into African markets in the way that is envisioned, or is there a bit of a gap still between what is being laid out as the ambition and what industry is perhaps willing to do?
Yes, thank you, Sarah. Thanks for having me here. I believe that I was hoping that you would tell me or would ask me, why do we have a gap still? Because I believe this is more or less, everyone recognizes that despite the policy, despite the will, in fact, we don't see this being translated into action on the field. And my perception is that first, we need to talk first about the materials that we are discussing about. So I believe what Rosetta was saying about copper is perhaps on the critical raw materials list a sort of outlier, copper and aluminium, because these are materials that are big markets, so they are not prone to price manipulation. But if you start looking to the other so-called critical raw materials, cobalt, even nickel, rare earths, all these things, sometimes the markets are small. And when the markets are small, they are prone to manipulation. And this is a problem because the main producer, or either at the production or at the transformation steps, is China. And China is, has been very active, as always, trying to control the market prices. So when they see that the market price might go up, and that might be a signal to new mines to open, they are very quick, normally, in putting some sort of dumping practice just to keep the market under control. The prices are down, and this is not, I mean, from the investor's perspective, that brings a lot of risk, and basically it freezes all sorts of, let's say, decisions, investment decisions in new mines. From the downstream side of the value chain, so the buyers, they're happy. They see these low prices, and they are happy with that. So they are not really willing to pay a sort of premium for having, let's say, lithium, or for having copper mined in, let's say, in a friendly country. So what you see is a sort of, how can I say that? It's a sort of, it's one of these situations where you have two separate realities. One is the policy space, where we have the wheel. We have, everyone understands that we are under stress because of the European reliance on imports, and we want to diversify away from China. But this is not really matching the economics and realities on the ground. On top of that, and that must also be pointed, we have the geopolitical instability. And I remember I was at the PDAC at the last edition in Toronto, and there was a session for investors with the name Copper or Gold. And basically, discussion was about, shall we invest in copper or shall we invest in gold? Being copper, of course, the side of people willing to go further with the energy transition. But then the conclusion of that session was, it's better to put money in gold. And that explains why, I believe this year, 60% of the exploration money was going to gold exploration. So the investors see gold as a sort of safe deposit. With the current geopolitical instability, I mean, we see what's happening in the United States, but also what's happening with the war between the Ukraine and or Russia and Ukraine, and also what's happening in Asia. So all these things basically keep the gold price very high and do not make the critical raw materials market attractive to European investors. So despite the policy will, there is no action in the ground. And I'm sorry, I don't see this changing unless we progress towards some sort of price floor mechanisms or de-risking mechanisms. Without that in place, things won't change. That's my opinion. Thank you.
No, I think it's definitely very aligned with what we're seeing, with very ambitious political commitments, that it's just very difficult to move that into practice, and especially with some minerals over others, you know, depending on, as you said, how big the market is, how vulnerable it is to either accidental or intentional oversupply that impacts prices. And I guess in this space, maybe just building off your comment about the price floor aspect a bit more, do you think that there is political will to, I guess, back up some of, I guess, address this gap with these mechanisms? So price floor, or even, dare I say the word, subsidies, but for, you know, for non-Chinese value chain products. When it comes to actually putting money on the table, is the commitment there, do you think?
Well, it's interesting that you are asking that, because I was in a panel discussion with the Vice President of the European Investment Bank, Mrs. Nicole Beer, and I was basically advocating for price floor mechanisms, saying that, in my opinion, that most probably that won't cost a penny or a cent to European taxpayers. And the reason why is that normally these price floor mechanisms, they establish a defined price range that will be paid for producers, meaning that even if the market price goes below that, let's say, that level, then the state will support the producer so the mine won't close, because as Rosetta just pointed out, if the mine closes and reopening, it will take years. And this is basically that's the advantage for the Chinese producers when they, as you said, when they overflow the market, so when they jump into dumping. My perception is that if you have that price, and if the market manipulators, if they decided to artificially keep prices down, they are just losing money, because not a single mine benefiting from price floor mechanisms will close. And then it does not make sense to jump into that sort of policy, because then it's suicidal. They are just losing money, and the benefit is zero, because no mines will be closing. And that prevents them from jumping or from establishing some sort of dumping. And I've seen that happen, for example, in silica, in high-grade purified silica. I've seen producers, basically they are trying to have their own resources, and then they announce to the market, I have my own resources. So if the market prices go above a certain level, I will start opening or extracting from my own mine, and basically that stop all the suppliers from, let's say, to practice excessive prices. So this sort of mechanism might cost zero, but unfortunately, the reply I got from Mrs. Beer was that does not depend on the European Investment Bank. It depends on member states. And at this point in Europe, we also have a lot of, I would say, misalignment between different member states. So we have member states like Germany or France, they are really committed, realizing that we should jump into this. You see other member states that are not so active, they don't see really this industry, despite the Draghi report pointing that we need to have to move on and to move faster. And then, of course, you have the member states that are always trying to basically to counter what's coming from Brussels. That's Hungary, and these days also Slovakia. So it's not easy for the European Commission and for the European Council to have an agreement. And without that agreement, it will be impossible to have a price floor mechanism supported by the European Investment Bank. So again, we are tangled in decisions made by policymakers, and I believe we need a strong political leadership to try to solve that knot. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Vitor. Coming to you, Veronica, like you have looked at these issues from both the foreign investor and the Africa side for many years in your work facilitating investment into Africa, most recently, well, certainly focusing very strongly now on critical minerals with your work with CMAG. What investment trends are you seeing in the mineral processing and value addition sector? You could even go into mining if you want to extend it. But where is investment coming from, either in terms of countries or companies, into what sort of projects and in what countries?
Thanks, Sarah. And let me start by saying thank you for having me, and really delighted to be part of this discussion. Yes, so with regards to investment trends, I think what we've seen is essentially the foundation has been laid by the fact that critical minerals will be doubling. The need for critical minerals will double by 2040. So this is shaping the sorts of investments that are going in. We've firstly seen investments into things like smelters and refineries across Africa. A few examples would include the likes in Rwanda, Luma, which is the creation of a tin smelter. They also have a gold refinery and a tantalum refinery. We've also seen recent development of a copper refinery, Buenoesa, in the DRC. In Tanzania, there's the Kabanga project, which is led by Temba Nickel and Lifezone Metals, which is refining copper, cobalt, and nickel. And obviously, we know that alongside the development of smelters and refineries, the demand for energy increases. So an example, in South Africa alone, we know that currently the mining sector pools 14% of energy consumption in South Africa. With the addition of smelters and refineries, that goes up to 30%. So a consideration, I think, in terms of how we would like to see further investment going into the continent if we're looking at building more of these smelters and refineries. And we've already touched on, how beneficial those are and whether subsidies need to come in. It's a bigger picture and a bigger conversation, but one for consideration is where's the energy going to come from? The second trend that we've seen has been a surge of mergers, acquisitions, joint ventures, and just general acquisitions in the mining sector. Some examples also, UK company Altona Rare Earths has acquired an 85% in Botswana Sesana Copper Silver Project from Ignite Minerals, and they've committed significant funds to accelerating further exploration and mine development. An Australian company known as Patriot Lithium has purchased a 90% stake in the Kitumba Copper large-scale exploration license, which is enabling obviously greater financing for exploration and production. And lastly, another example is another UK company, Jubilee Metals, has expanded its holdings in Zambia, acquiring Project G to boost copper output to 25,000 tonnes per year. So again, you are seeing this real interest into local acquisitions, local JV opportunities, clearly an indicator of where market movement is going. And then, we've seen other sort of higher profile investments. China's Baowu Steel Group, for example, in Guinea has acquired stakes in the Simandou iron ore project. In Mali, we've seen investments in the Ganfeng lithium mine to the tune of $342 million with Leo Lithium and another Australian company. And also in Zambia, a UAE based International Resource Holdings has acquired Mopani Copper, as mentioned by Rosetta earlier, to the tune of 1.1 billion. So again, lots of investments specifically into these mines. The third area we're seeing a lot of investment trends are in the sovereign wealth funds. So a number of countries have developed sovereign wealth funds. In my mind, in CMAG's opinion, we are in favour of this because it just invests back into much needed infrastructure, capacity building and the like. So some examples of some of the funds, sovereign wealth funds that currently exist are the Pula Fund in Botswana. In Ghana, there's two. There's Ghana Heritage Fund as well as MIF, Minerals Income Investment Fund. Also, taking funds from the mining sector, particularly in the gold space in Ghana. There's the Nigerian Sovereign Investment Authority in Nigeria. In Angola, there's the FSDEA. Obviously, that's born more from the oil side, from the extractive side, but again, another sovereign wealth fund example. And lastly, another example in Namibia. I'm going to butcher the name, but I think it's Welwitschia Fund. And again, that's really linked to the mining of some of their minerals and investing that back into the country. So that's another emerging space that we're seeing, homegrown investments coming from the sovereign wealth funds. And we're also lastly seeing some innovative financing solutions. The likes of General Motors, BYD, investing specifically in mines, lithium mines, so that they can shore up supply. So that's an investment trend that's emerging, as I say, but one to watch. So some exciting developments across the continent. And I just would like to pick up on the point that Vital made earlier around the European standpoint. I think it's interesting to see how, European investment is slightly different, perhaps, approach to other investments that we've seen from other countries such as Australia, Japan, China, and so on. And I think we would like to see more investment from our European partners specifically in the infrastructure space and also in the capacity building space. I think that's where perhaps it's more hesitant in terms of where the capital will go. I think you can shore up in those areas where there's DFI development and financing. And so, yeah, I think that's a space I would like to see more for European financing going.
Very interesting. There's a lot of very interesting developments happening and new players. I mean, we obviously have some growing or change in presence of some of the older players, Australia, particularly even some of the Canadian mines. But the entry of Gulf players and I guess more of a proactive sovereign wealth fund and national investment in either value addition, diversification, capacity building is a really interesting development. Where do you think we will be going in the next while? Where do you think more interest will be coming from in terms of investment? Would this mainly be from the Gulf, or it's a bit early to tell? What do you think?
It's $1 million question, and you know, if I get it right, someone needs to pay me well. I think I personally have seen huge interest from our UAE partners. You know, mostly there's talk specifically, if you go to Saudi Arabia, there's real talk around the super region. So you know, strategically, the Saudi sees itself straddling both sides, both east and west, and so it plays a role in terms of, you know, working with the African continent as well as working with partners in other markets. So I think I've seen more interaction, more investment specifically in the mines. But I want to sort of pose a question, and maybe that will link into how I see things going, or where I'd like to see things going. Maybe I could just amend it slightly. I think for Africa to really get involved in the supply chain, in the value chain, we really need to start seeing, as I've said, mass investment into our energy, into our infrastructure, and into our water resources. Because ultimately, if Africa's going to have that economic growth story that we're all wanting to see, we need to start building markets from within the continent, as well as looking for partners outside of it. So investment into these like foundational areas that I've mentioned are really critical in terms of not just developing critical minerals value chains, but value chains in general, whether it be agro-processing, whether it be, you know, technology. We need to start seeing our partners investing in those foundational areas to allow other things to come from that. In terms of us, Africa being involved or investing contributing to the battery minerals space or battery minerals supply chain, I think it's the only space I see that happening right now is in the skills and in the capacity. You know, Africa's going to have a population surge in 30 years, 2.6 billion. And we have a wealth of under 18s who are going to need jobs. So from my perspective, investment into technical skills, technical colleges to ensure that that population boom will not have a home in terms of where they can, you know, source their next job. I think we need to invest in those things now to allow those technical skills to then input into those electric vehicle supply chains. You know, China trains 100,000 engineers a year. And I wouldn't say that we're even close to that for the entire continent. So I really would think that if we are going to sort of contribute in a meaningful way, you know, I would love to see more investment into this space. And I think, to draw on the earlier question about where we see European partners getting more involved, that's specifically an area I think that they could really, really sort of start to fund and seek investment opportunities into the development of these technical colleges to support the industry growth. So yeah, that's where I'd like to see it going. But in terms of where I see partnerships forming, you know, geopolitics is shaping the way that that's happening. But I've seen far more from the US, particularly with the Lobito corridor, and I'm seeing a lot more from our UAE partners and from Saudi Arabia. And Europe to an extent, also supporting, say, projects like the Lobito corridor. But yeah, I think I'd like to see kind of more engagement from the European partners. Thank you.
Okay. No, thanks, Veronica. It really is those enabling factors for industry, which includes value addition in the mineral sector, but all industry across the board, really, that needs a lot more attention. Okay, no, thank you very much. I'm going to come just to a second round of questions for all of you before we turn to the Q&A session. So starting with you, Rosetta, back to this question on regional cooperation around mineral value addition. So Zambia does have some of these joint efforts with DRC. At least there's been some policy momentum, shall we call it. Where has that gone in practice? And what do you think it would really take to unlock more regional cooperation on these issues?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah, again. First and foremost, I like to define that relationship as, number one, timely, something that is timely, but also symbolic of where we should be going, basically from extractive competition to collaborating or cooperation in beneficiation as a region. So that is a very good start. That model may actually be some model that may redefine how we work across Africa in terms of ensuring that our specific and unique raw materials that we have across basically is put to good use in a more collaborative way as a region. Where are we? So a few things have happened. I think it's very slow for what we thought it was going to be. But a few things have happened. Things like feasibility studies obviously have happened. Selection of sites where they want to do some of these zones in both countries has happened. We've seen quite a lot of interest from investors talking about it, from the US, from the EU, in terms of not just the batteries themselves, but also in terms of the minerals that will be going into these in these production value chains themselves. We've also seen that the most impediment I see basically is institutional coordination remains a big challenge. So we're dealing with two governments with two different kind of approach to the institutions. And so you see that the issue hasn't just been from the idea itself, but from how institutions can actually collaborate in actual sense. You see the regulatory requirements are completely different. Infrastructure readiness is completely different. What the politicians are focusing on seems to be completely different between these two governments, which is very interesting to actually see. And I think that has affected momentum on this project, because you're looking at it from a lot of faces other than just the idea itself. The idea, you look at it, brilliant. But the moment you involve the human beings and institutions, it's been a project of meetings other than actual implementation. In one of the meetings, I actually asked to say, what are the governments still doing with that? Why hasn't the private sector actually already taken off to actually invest if that was a very feasible kind of investment area? So we've seen a little bit of delays. There's been lessons learned, obviously. I think the biggest lesson is we need, as we approach some of these things, to first, of course, have institutional trusts between governments, because they seem to be territorial kind of approach. No, in Zambia, in whatever, you see, and there's also no harmonization of even industry standards itself. I think we need to look at that, but also we also need to ensure that we are openly sharing risks between governments, whether it's two or more in the future that will be in any of these collaborations. So I think we really need to understand and learn that joint value chains demand more than just mineral proximity. It demands governance proximity. How well are you aligned with the partners in terms of governments that you're going into this for you to actually make progress? Because what I have seen from my experience, it has not been anything to do with minerals. The minerals are there. Proximity with Zambia and Congo is not a question. Areas where they can do that, and I think investor interest is there. But then what is the biggest problem? I think it's governance issues that have delayed us.
Okay, so really a need for regional economic blocks to work together on harmonization of standards, joint understandings of how things could be approached, and
having shared visions.
Shared visions. And the trust point is really important, because the competition at the moment is kind of crowding out room for cooperation, and shifting that aspect is going to be critical, because otherwise you just can't get that coming together that is needed.
Yep.
Okay.
And maybe just to add, remember that this partnership, Congo seems actually to have more resource than Zambia anyway, in terms of cobalt, in terms of copper for now, in terms of production. They actually do have an upper hand already. And I think there's been that attitude to I mean, we're not going to wait for you. We're going. We're doing this and we're doing that. And that misalignment has been there in the process.
Okay. No, very interesting. Thank you. Victor, coming to you, I mean, a slightly different aspect of, of this critical minerals discussion, and certainly one that is, very much in focus in Europe is more attention being paid to recycling and substitution of materials. So, what Rosetta was speaking about earlier, the increased use of aluminium rather than copper for some of these applications. And I know that Interraw does quite a lot of work in the space of recycling and substitution. Do you see any prospects for, for European African cooperation in this space, or just more broadly, your take on the space within Europe itself?
Yes, thank you, Sarah. And yes, absolutely yes. But first, let me say I was looking for a sort of applause button just to applauding Rosetta when she was mentioning the governance challenges, and also Veronica when you were saying that when you were talking about the areas of, or preferential areas of investments from the European side into African partnerships. So I fully agree with both on the comments that you just made. Now, replying to you, Sarah, about recycling. First, everyone knows these days, at least in Europe, that recycling is not sufficient to solve the problem that we have. So what some European companies are trying to do immediately is to transform, so they are adjusting their business models, and they are moving from being a mining company and transforming into something like a metals provider. So they are trying to combine the mining operation and the recycling operation, sometimes on the same site, meaning that they benefit from transports that go with the ore to the smelting or processing areas, and then they are returning with materials to be recycled. So the operations sometimes are not so different. I mean, extracting from a rock or extracting the metals with value from industrial waste. So these are not so different, and they provide space for these business adjustments or business models adjustment. Nevertheless, we have problems in Europe. Being the first, I mean, we must recognize that we are among the best. I mean, Europeans and Japanese are probably the best in the world in recycling, but nevertheless, on the from the perspective of manufacturers, we still have gaps because things are not being designed for recycling, meaning that, and this goes from the more complex to the more simple stuff. I mean, you just open a can of tuna made in Europe, and you see that you have layers of plastic covering the metal. You go for to the supermarket and you buy bread, and you see that the package has plastic and paper together. So these things are very difficult to recycle, and European industries and companies, sometimes they go into directions that do not make life easier for recyclers. But there are, I would say, also positive news coming, especially for cooperation with Africa. So we have seen that many companies in Europe, as I said, they are looking to alternative sources of material, and they have been looking to mine waste. And I remember there is recently some cooperation with Mopani, one of the companies that Rosetta was mentioning, because European universities and research centers are looking to the waste, so to the mine waste and to the materials that are being disposed as waste, to see if we can still extract some copper from those materials. And this is happening across Africa in several projects where Europeans are playing a role. So this is an opportunity for cooperation. But I believe that if you want to have a sort of different entry point, I will support in absolutely the point made by Veronica that we need to have more cooperation on infrastructure, and in particular infrastructure connected with the energy production, because we know that these days we don't have many big miners in Europe. We have a couple of medium to small size operations, but we have great construction companies, so we can basically support African governments if they want to develop big dams or energy infrastructure projects. We are good at that. And of course, we are also good at skills. I mean, we still have universities with strong reputations in the mining arena, in engineering and geology. And so cooperation between African and European universities is something that should be stimulated, because that will help Africans cover the skills gap. And also it will help us in Europe getting access to these materials. And of course, it will facilitate dialogues, because we have seen that countries that are going down that road, the Japan and Australia, have been quite active trying to stimulate cooperation with African countries at the academic level. And we see that really creates some sort of bonds that facilitate dialogues later on. Thank you, Sarah.
Great, thank you very much, Vitor. Now, your point about the electricity infrastructure support, I think, is really, really well placed. And we were speaking just before the webinar went live about these transmission interconnectors that are connecting different African countries, allowing energy trade to happen. And the EU has been a very big advocate of that work. And so the Tanzania-Zambia one, which is, I think, just starting some of the preparation at this phase, is the EU is a big funder of the preparation work to get that underway. And I think is definitely a place where they can give some very valuable support.
And Sarah, if I may, just to point out, because sometimes we don't realize that countries like DRC has no geological survey. It's one example of, I would say, a low-hanging fruit where the Europeans could support Africans, because many of the information is perhaps being stored in Belgium, as it happens with Portugal. I remember one of the first years I worked in Angola, the notebooks from the geological maps were in Portugal and not in Rwanda. So this sort of cooperation should be instant and should be stimulated at once, because we can really have fruitful relationships coming from that. Thank you.
Definitely. No, thank you for that. Veronica, I'm going to turn to you. A bit of a hard question, but to somewhat sum up this discussion we've had so far, and from your perspective of really having looked at both sides of this for some time, what do you think is really needed to unlock European engagement, whether it's in mining, value addition, or as some of the other points that we've raised, infrastructure capacity building? You have covered this already a little bit, so anything that you would like to add, feel free to do so.
Sure. Maybe just to pick on some of the things that have been mentioned already. I was delighted to hear about the investment from European partners into the interconnectors. It's a point I made, I think, when we were last together, Sarah, in Brussels last year, and it was, to me, it made little sense that Tanzania had excess power, 3 hydro plants closed because of excess power, and yet next door in Zambia there was none. So for me, this is fantastic and exactly the sort of partnerships that we need. What do I see? What would I like to see more of? I guess, yes, I have answered some of it, but maybe other points I didn't make, which are around how can we support Africa create a stronger market from within its own borders? So for me, that whole piece around intra-African trade is vital, but specifically because if we can enable people to have purchasing power and for them to purchase items locally and create those markets, to me, I think that's where, the biggest opportunities lie. And so how can we support that kind of market growth? To me, that is definitely investing in some of our SMEs and our mid-sized businesses. I've done extensive work in Ghana, where we worked moving Ghana from 0 OEMs to now 15 through policy, robust policy framework and incentive framework over a 4-year period. And just taking that example, we actually started investing in some of the medium-sized businesses and the SMEs, because what we want to see is a growth of PLCs tomorrow. And I think that's really important, because, if we're able to invest in, say, a local automotive firm, then that will then create market demand locally, and the rest we know, that just moves us up the chain, increases GDP, etc. So whilst at the same time looking at how we can work with international partners and attract in that sort of big ticket anchor investment, we also at the same time would need our partners in Europe, for example, to look at some of our growing mid-sized businesses, growing SMEs that require that financing. Local financing is an issue right now. So is there a way in which European banks and European partners can support that growth, specifically in the areas like automotive, like agro-processing? That to me would be a great area. I love the point Rosetta made around governance, the governance piece. And I think harmonization across borders is a vital piece in terms of how we create those value chains. Each country, as Rosetta mentioned, is looking at itself, and the approach needs to be one of how can we attract investors? That's the critical point here. You attract investors by the market size that you possess. And the bigger the market, the more attractive you are. So it's a simple equation here. If we're able to then broaden out our scope and look beyond our own borders into how can we partner with our neighbors to allow that value chain to increase, I think that would be a great way in which we can look to our European partners for support in terms of how can we harmonize our policies, how can we create these frameworks, how can we create these incentives to attract investors into a wider market in the African space. So that would be the second point. And just to labor the last point around skills and capacity development, with a growing population, we need jobs. And I think that is something where technical skills, we've got an abundance of skills in Europe. There's a scheme I know that's currently an exchange between Holland and parts of Africa, specifically around the pharmaceutical space, where retired pharmaceutical individuals are able to go and sort of share learnings and experience with people on the ground on the continent. And to me, that's a great example of how you can create skills exchange at low cost. And so how can we kind of look at more of these sorts of schemes across different sectors? I think that's another area that we could develop further. So I think those are the key points I wanted to make. And of course, we're very buoyed and excited by this, ongoing project of the Lobito Corridor, which will open up, essentially the whole part of Southern Africa. And I think and there's clear opportunities there for investment and support from our European partners. So, yeah, there we go. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Veronica. There's some very interesting comments in the Q&A box from Eric and Juro around some of the geological survey and also data. I do encourage anyone attending to just look at some of these comments. Very interesting. I think the point around Europe supporting on some geological surveying is really important. And there is some very good work being done by EU delegations on that. I know in Namibia, there's quite a lot of investment they're making in improving surveying capacity building, also to make sure that this can continue beyond donor projects. So it is an area that is being looked at. I think just picking up on the comments a bit and maybe reframing into a bit of a question for you, Rosetta, around Zambia and DRC and this regional cooperation angle. I mean, one of the things that I have wondered is how much of the stumbling that is happening on bringing this to reality is also because the two countries have the same strengths and the same weaknesses in some ways. Like they're bringing the same things to the table in terms of minerals, but also bringing some of the same weaknesses to the table in terms of skills, electricity, financing, shortages. What could change if there was a partner that had more complementary a complementary offering as such? But I know this is a bigger issue across not just Southern Africa, but Africa more generally, just in terms of how do you have complementary partnerships rather than bringing the same things to the table, but including the same weaknesses.
Yeah, and I agree. And basically, what you're asking is exactly what Veronica and Vito, I think, have actually said, where number one, as you say, we got like the similar raw materials. It's copper, it's cobalt, it's graphite, it's whatever it is. And same weaknesses in terms of whether it's skills, financing. And I think that's what we're looking for. And when EU or USA pronounce themselves to be part of this MOU, that's exactly what they need to be bringing to the table. to actually complement, because the raw material is actually there. And that's why my statement was look beyond the availability of the raw material, because that's obvious. Let's look at what other complementary issues we need to resolve to actually make this move. Is it financing? And the answer is yes. Is it technology? The answer is yes. We have lack of skills. We have all these things need to be put part and parcel and be very clear where we're going to access that. And the partners that we have currently able to. Of course, I know EU, even the US itself is so big at ESG. And so it's a little bit difficult to actually go past that in Congo. You may actually go past that in Zambia better than you can go in Congo, but your resource is actually in Congo. So I don't know how we actually clean up some of those materials that are coming from Congo in terms of some of the standards that the EU would be looking for. But I think that that's exactly it. You've got a point there to say, look, how can we then strengthen what we already have? And who are we supposed to be looking out to actually come in? And remember also, both in Congo and in Zambia, even though we've got the EU and we've got the US on the table, China has infiltrated. China is like everywhere. And so I don't know how EU and US is going to deal with that. And so you create other geopolitical kind of issues that obviously are not just very clear and simple to see. So we need to put all that to the table.
I think just to add to what Rosetta said, which is spot on, you know, and really quite an important point to drum on, is the fact that, you know, the way to conduct business on the continent has changed significantly in the last 20 years. And I think the European approach may be slightly, if for want of a better word, dated. I think, you know, if we look at the market right now and the way that China operates on the continent and other partners, you know, it's getting deals done as opposed to checklists of, you know, certain things that needed to be abided by. And I think if you're an African nation thinking about population growth, thinking about the fact people don't have food to eat, etc., and those fundamentals, who are you going to more likely go with? Are you going to go with the one that's asking you to do lots of checklists, or are you going to go to the one who wants to get a deal done? And so it's about framing your approach to suit the current needs on the continent. And I think, I'm not saying let's do away with ESG, by no means, not at all. But what I'm saying is one needs to start thinking more and adapt to the way in which business is currently run to allow for, you know, the influence of other partners to come into the continent. And I think that's a really important point to make, is the approach from Europe to me seems still dated, and I would like to see a modernization of its approach to Africa. And you know, the sooner the better, frankly, because we really would like to see other partners on the continent, you know, and getting involved in all those other spaces that I mentioned. But yes, to your point, Rosetta, completely agree.
Thank you, Veronica. I wonder if I could just come back to you, Veronica, also just on the Lobito corridor that you mentioned. I mean, it tails off Rosetta's contributions too. How do we make sure that this big infrastructure investment is actually more than just facilitating mineral extraction in a quicker and cheaper way, but actually is contributing to keeping more value on the continent in terms of processing? I mean, Europe has a lot of experience with building out important trade corridors. But just what are your thoughts on this, Veronica, how we can make sure that it's not just, quicker extraction rather than a proper investment in industrialization in Africa?
Yeah, that's a good question.
I'm putting you on the spot, but thank you.
You know, that's okay. No, I think, you know, immediately what comes to mind is there needs to be some real thinking now to look forward into 20, 30 years where we want to see the Lobito corridor and how we can support the countries that feed along that corridor to really have a movement up the value chain. So value addition or beneficiation or processing, etc. I think at the moment we're looking very specifically on the continent in the battery mineral space. So it's around how can we you know, evacuate those minerals to markets where, you know, electric vehicles perhaps, you know, are being made, etc. However, I'd quite like to see us looking at other minerals that we could develop for the local markets. You know, we've mentioned things like copper, and I love the point that Rosetta made around, you know, moving up. There are other uses of copper that perhaps we're not even looking at. Those kind of studies and feasibility studies need to be done now to look at what other value chains we can be developing from the mineral wealth that Africa possesses, not just specifically on the battery minerals. So that's things like your iron ore. That's, of course, copper's already been mentioned. It's gold. Definitive markets, less likely, as Vitor mentioned, on the whole price volatility, market fluctuation, protectionism, stockpiling. You know, where can we create value in some of those minerals for the local market as well? So mine is a two-pronged approach. I want to see localization, but I also want to see us partnering with partners outside of the continent. So it's a two-pronged approach, and I think that will really solidify the Lobito corridor as a project that will last the ages and will create jobs and will accelerate industrialization and therefore accelerate economic growth. So it's almost like looking forward to look back. So can we think about where we want to be in 30 years and what do we need to get there? And that's your looking back so that you can then put things in place to allow that to happen. And I think it goes back to what I said earlier with regards the supporting of cross-border engagement. So your regulation, your policy frameworks, your incentive frameworks, how can you attract investors into the spaces by creating these policies that will support the government or the country that has those minerals, but also the extraction of some of those minerals, you know, perhaps moving up that value chain and exporting out. So yeah, a couple of ideas there.
Thanks, Veronica. I want to come to Vitor. I saw you would like to answer one of the questions that Eric has raised in the chat. So could you quickly just summarize the question and go ahead and answer?
Yes, and before that, Sarah, if I may just to add on the Lobito corridor question and on Veronica points, you are absolutely right. I mean, we should, and I believe this should be an African led decision. I mean, in that corridor, where do you find minerals and where can you develop industrial clusters? Because this is what we have been doing in Europe. So basically looking to, and we know that minerals and mineral deposits, they don't move, so they are where they are. But if you have a place where you combine the transport corridor, the energy supply, and the mineral deposit, then you can start developing an industrial cluster. And that, of course, brings together suppliers, providers of knowledge, and all these things basically support the local development. And it doesn't need to be about copper or, let's say, critical raw materials. Sometimes I've seen this in Nigeria, for instance. Nigeria was importing limestone for water treatment. It's one of these countries where the population is exploding, so water treatment is crucial. And limestone, I would say, it's a basic industrial mineral. So it's not difficult to find it in Africa. So there is no need for imports of limestone from, I believe, in any African country. So this is the sort of mindset that needs to be in place to take advantage of these infrastructures like the Lobito corridor. This said, on the question that Eric was raising, is absolutely right. I mean, I was giving the example of Belgium as an example. It's not only the Tervuren Museum. I believe that also the geological survey held in Brussels is also cooperating with the DRC. But you find data from many African countries all across geological surveys. The Czech Republic Geological Survey has data from Africa, and they never had African colonies. Slovenians also have data on Africa, because you have many cooperation projects that were made between different countries, bilateral cooperation projects, and data is there. And sometimes it's forgotten. I mean, you still have the maps published, but if you want to see the notebooks and more detailed information, sometimes you need to go to Europe, and that doesn't make any sense. So it's, as I said, it's a low-hanging fruit for cooperation, just waiting for someone to lead in that effort. Thank you.
Thanks, Vitor. And I think really a need for digitization and integrating all of the resources that have been collected over the years, because, yeah, a lot of it is in paper form and is difficult to overlay with other information that's since come in. It would be interesting to know a little bit more about these digitization efforts that may be going on in different African countries. We have a few minutes left of the session, and I wondered whether we could just get a very short summary of key points that you would like the audience to take away today. Maybe starting Rosetta, Vitor, and Veronica. Just a couple of minutes summarizing the key points.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, Sarah. I think, of course, number one, it's not debatable that key focus areas for the next few years is going to go into critical raw materials, of course, to ensure we've got the net zero achieved. And that obviously copper, as Veronica had said earlier, is not even going to multiply. I think it's a bit quadruple in terms of what we are going to need. And there will obviously be a deficit even when we get there, talk about 2040, 2045. So there has to be quite a lot of investment in this area that is needed. And we would definitely have to then look for these resources, where we are going to get these resources. And countries like Zambia, like Congo, and other producers of such raw materials have really got to get their act together if they really are going to benefit from this process. We need to be very clear about what our needs are, and how we can clearly benefit. We've had a history of complaints of how we have not benefited from our raw materials, but I think this is a great opportunity for us to rethink, reset, and actually be the ones to set what really should happen in this instance. The world needs the resource. And so the world basically is coming to us with a begging bowl, which basically places us in a better space than us trying to take to the world what they don't need. So I really, really think that that's a great opportunity for us. Thank you.
Thanks, Rosetta. Vitor, your closing remarks.
Yes, thank you, Sarah. Well, I'd like to highlight that, in my opinion, it's paramount that European policymakers go to the field, talk with the people and with local governments and decide what to do. As Veronica was saying, it's not the right, or the best way is not going with the ESG list of requirements. It might be easier to try to understand what are the capacities and then build on that, the local capacities, and build on that. It's true that we should look to, especially in mining, we should look to these new projects as seeds for development. And then probably a missing metric is how can this project contribute not only to the country development, or not only to us in Europe, because we need the raw materials, but also how can that project contribute to local development. And this is, I would say, a metric that can be easily translated. And of course, with political commitment, then it will be easier to de-risk the projects. And by de-risking, I'm talking about governance, and I'm also talking about financial de-risking, which is, for the moment, the big problem. But if you manage to have local support to a project and good governance in place, then that will be facilitating things a lot. Finally, to close, just to say that we don't have many big miners in Europe, but we have a lot of people and companies with experience in the infrastructure development. So this is our strength, and this is where I believe Europeans should partner closely with Africans. Thank you.
My turn, I
Sorry,
guess.
please go ahead, Veronica. Sorry.
Yeah, well, no problem. I'm always told I overtalk, so I just was sitting back and waiting, like the support as like I'm supposed to. So to summarize the points and kind of key takeaways, I guess for me it's around how can we encourage the partnership between Europe and Africa further, and I think it's through a couple of ways. One is more practically looking at how we can deploy technical assistance and grants for our mid-sized businesses, for our SMEs who are in the sectors and spaces that will support industrialization and will support critical minerals development. Critical minerals are not a sector on their own. They help accelerate other sectors to grow. And so for me, it's around how can we ensure that there's some localization, but we need to invest through technical assistance, through grants, our mid-size and SME bases. I think that's really, really vital as a piece. So that's one. Two, it's around the partnerships. How can we solidify the partnerships? You know, and have lasting influence. I think it's in the things I've mentioned earlier, technical skills. How can we invest in some of the energy requirements that the continent desperately needs? We've already heard about interconnectors, but I'd love to start seeing some investment into the transmission and distribution lines as well, into the, you know, investing into the baseload requirements. Of course, policies vital for attracting investment. And I think, you know, that's another area that I think, you know, the partnership between Europe and Africa could further be solidified. How can we support in terms of policy development, incentive development, and of course, creating, you know, special economic zones, etc. And also looking at geospatial mapping. We've talked about surveying. You know, some countries have as little as 8% surveyed. We need to have way more to understand how much we have in the ground, how long for, and what we can deploy it for. So that's a vital piece. And lastly, I'd like to just maybe put a little challenge out there, which is, can we see a European bank, a European partner, spearhead the next Lobito corridor, please? I think to me that would be very exciting. We saw Africa Finance Corporation, they are leading the way for the Lobito corridor. You know, they were the first to put the money down and others followed. And I'd like to see perhaps, you know, our European partners perhaps doing that. And looking at other trading corridors, which there are a multitude that need to be developed across the continent. And I'd love to just put that challenge out there, and let's meet next year and see what's been done.
Thank you, Veronica. And thank you to all of the panelists. I really, really appreciate your insights today. This has been a great webinar. Thank you so much.
Welcome.
Thank
Lovely
you,
to be
Sarah.
here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Happy to be here too. Bye.
Bye-bye.